I want to talk about Giannis and Embiid to start today's podcast. There's a couple different things depending on where the timeline. So I'll just kind of jump into it. So if we look at the start of the season for the Milwaukee Bucks, not great, Bob. They're 1-6. We can keep talking about Chris Middleton coming back, but I mean, even with him back, I don't know. What is? Hey, everything's fixed. I can't imagine that they're going to be this bad. I think I'll always hold out hope for them to be competitive, or hey, that's a tough out in the playoffs just because of Giannis. To me, he's top 3 player in the league. He's still fantastic. But when you look back at their timeline, you go through the franchise index. Okay, when's the last time you were scared of them? Well, 2 years ago, they won 58 games, but we all know they lost the Heat in the 1-8 matchup. Giannis missed half of that series with that back injury, but that was alarming. And when a team dies, it's different than when a person dies, because when a person dies, there's the date that we know that it happened. And when it happens to a team, we usually don't know the date until after it's happened, where you'll look back and go, oh, that's when it all went downhill. And I think at this point, there's an argument to be made 2+ years later, like that might have been it. But because of Giannis, I don't like doing that. We can look at the rest of the future stuff and say, okay, well, Dame probably hasn't been the ceiling raiser that you would have hoped, but they weren't healthy last year going into the playoffs. So, here we go again. Their draft capital has been talked about a lot. They don't control any of their first round picks until 2031. And it's important to remember that control and then not having any are two entirely different things. Where if a swap doesn't happen, or if a swap does happen and then they have the other team's pick, it means on draft night they could trade that pick. So it's not like there's no possibility of pulling anything off. They burned 5 second rounders on Jay Crowder, which should be a lesson. And I've seen a lot of looking at their picks in the late first, early seconds, these rotation hopefuls that haven't worked out, where I think that part becomes a little unfair to franchise just because of how hard it is. It'd be nice to hit on one and feel like it's a real rotation contributor, but is it realistic that you're going to draft anybody in that spot? Sure, Tyrese Maxey worked out, but it was just a brilliant pick. It worked out. It's beyond expectations. But for the most part, I just think you start to pile on some of these franchises where it feels like they're losing all kinds of momentum. So when Giannis was talking with Sam Amick, who had relayed this joke where he basically was asking Giannis, what do you think will happen? And Giannis kind of jokingly grabbed a staffer and said, hey, if we don't win, do you think you'll get fired? And then he alluded to, and I'm paraphrasing the entire quote here because the point of the quote, it felt like it was a joke that got turned into something else, where it was a hint when Giannis was like, who knows, maybe I would get traded. And then you're thinking, all right, is this anything? Does this actually mean anything? And then they get off to this awful start. All right, so let's hold that thought for a second. Embiid has had a different week. He had some media availability where he said, quote, I've done too much for this fucking city. And when that made the rounds, I'll admit the first time I saw it, I went, uh-oh, that's pretty heavy. Then when you went and looked at all of the available audio and why he was so upset, it was directly related to the fact that the columnist that made one of the toughest transitions and one of the worst points you'll make, you want to get on Embiid for not playing enough, fine. You want to point out that if he wants to have some kind of legacy in the city, okay, fine, but you can't do that without playing and honoring your brother who died in a car accident. Again, I cannot believe somebody wrote that was like, yep, that's the point I want to make. So Embiid was really more upset about that specific thing. That motivated that quote, where when that quote lived by itself without more depth, I thought, is this some kind of hint about how Embiid feels about his relationship with the organization and the city and all these different things? And then, of course, he gets to the altercation this weekend. He's been suspended 3 games. Yes, I've seen the joke about the real suspension should make him play 3 games. I've seen the joke, folks. So Embiid signed a 3-year extension in September with Philadelphia. So what does that mean? Well, the extension was 3 years, $193 million. That takes him through 28-29. He declined a player's option in 26-27. So that's the 2 years, get rid of the option, add the 3 new ones. So that means in 28-29 at 35 years old, Joel Embiid will be making $69 million a year. That $69 million a year number sounds staggering right now when the cap goes up, as it does. I mean, if you really wanted to be nasty, you could go, well, fourth highest in career earnings, and you've done, I think, are you talking about second round appearances? But that's not, I don't know that that's entirely, I mean, I guess from just a basketball sense, you could say that it's entirely fair, but I think there's probably more to it. And when you're Embiid, you're not sitting around. Like the relationship with a pro athlete in the organization in the city, like how many athletes would be like, I've been really well compensated and all my dreams have come true and I haven't done enough. So it's all my fault. It's usually not what happens. So the frustration of the week, maybe there's nothing to worry about here unless it has been really quiet in the NBA trade landscape, next mad NBA player. My default rule was always when it's quiet, just give it a few more months because that's how this league had been going for a really long time. We had nothing really of significance this summer. The trade deadline show I did with Simmons, Super Bowl week, we spent 30 minutes on Bogdanovich going to the Knicks because there was nothing else to talk about. A little cap clear there for an OKC Charlotte deal. I mean, that was a dead trade deadline show. And I remember thinking about Bogdanovich going, knowing Tibbs, I wonder if Bogdanovich will even be part of the closing group with the Knicks. But we had nothing else to talk about. So the reminder is, once again, it's been kind of quiet. It's been kind of quiet since the Harden 3 trade requests in 3 years run. I guess you could say Donovan Mitchell a little bit, but that was more about a team that was entirely ready to turn the page and go in a different direction after they'd already moved Royce O'Neal and then the Gobert part of that. Shout out to Windhorst. And then, Mitchell ends up in Cleveland. I think the Cleveland thing is kind of funny because there were so many behind the scenes rumblings, which I want to bring up with Giannis here, where it's like, Mitchell's probably gone. And that was just what everybody was kind of saying the same thing and repeating everything else. And then Mitchell ends up staying and signing his extension, right, with Cleveland. So we're going to know that part of it. So after our timeline of Ben Simmons, I don't even know if Ben Simmons counts. I feel like he shouldn't, but he does. I probably could bring up Dame Lillard as like a soft version of it, the Garnett trade request, where you definitely want to be traded, but you definitely care, especially coming from a smaller market, of how you're perceived. You want it to be like a friendly divorce, like, hey, I'm still going to be in the kid's life, and if you need any help around the house, like, I love using the DeWalt. So the Lillard one is real. It's just not like full blown anarchy like we've had with some other ones. I've also brought up this point, which I think is an interesting point, but not necessarily like a predictor of the future, that the U.S. guys and the international guys, the stars in the NBA, the track record is that it's 2 different approaches. The U.S. guys, when they're over it, are like, I'm out. I'm over it. You figure it out. The international guys have not done that. They just haven't. Doesn't mean it's never going to happen. I believe it will happen at some point, but I only bring it up not as a predictor, but as an interesting part of the discussion. So I think the question you have to ask is, did we get any real clues? Like, did we get any real clues throughout any of this? Well, my first thing would be, as bad as the Bucks are, talk to me 20 plus games in. I don't want to really think I know anything about a basketball team, especially one with somebody like Giannis still on it. I don't want to, it's an awful start. I get how bad it is, but let's see where we're at 20 plus games in. All right. The Sixers, the real Sixers haven't even started yet. So that record is completely irrelevant. Like, I can't judge a basketball thing that's not even the real thing yet. They just got Paul George back, and Embiid, after the suspension, is going to, at least he's scheduled to be making his season debut here. So the real part of what the Sixers are, I can't even tell you what it looks like because none of us have even seen it. But I guess because I love talking about the NBA and this is part of the NBA product, I do have those moments where I wonder, like, what if it really did get that bad in Milwaukee this year? What if it was just a disastrous year for the Sixers? Like, what if it just doesn't work out? What would happen? Because the other part of this, that's the more modern version of what we've seen in the NBA, and I don't know that has a direct correlation to the lack of angry trade demands that I've talked about here, is that you could see this happening a few years ago where the players just take the extensions. right? It is the NBA transfer portal. They don't. It's like, all right, well, sure. If you're going to, like Embiid, he could have waited it out, but based on his track record and his history of health issues, like when the Sixers did the extension, you could argue he just wanted the extension already. Like, is that a good thing? Is that a good sign? And they did it. And even with that extension, I don't think the stigma exists anymore of, well, you just signed this extension. Like Durant. Durant's 4-year extension with the Nets hadn't even kicked in yet. And he was like, fire everybody. Okay, you're not. Now I want out of here. And then he came back and they played up until the deadline. So the extensions feel irrelevant now about like, well, how will this look if I've signed an extension and it's going out until 28, 29, and I were to hint at the soft launch into a trade demand. Look, even with Embiid's health and how bad the back years could look, I think most front offices, if he were ever available, would say, oh my God, that's awful at the end. Okay, cool, let's do it. Because we don't have anything that matches that. Like maybe it's a 2-year window here, and then we take all of our medicine later on. Maybe some smart teams would just go like, look, we can't do something like that. Giannis is entirely different. Turns 30 soon. Yes, we can talk about his athleticism being the basis of his dominance, and as that declines, I think sometimes we are at a point now where we have to start thinking about the windows just being extended beyond anything we've ever seen growing up. So a less athletic Giannis at 33, probably still really, really good. And I think a Giannis thing, if it were to get to that, would be in a different market altogether. And it's why when you look at OKC, even though they've been like frugal about everything and saying, well, we don't want to do this, we don't do that. The crazy thing is OKC could maybe win this whole thing this year. And you could make some kind of argument of like, would you want to disrupt that? But that's not usually how basketball teams operate. They would go, what are we going to look like when our 5 best players are out there all at the same time? And we could add Giannis to that mix on top of everything that we already have. Like that would feel like the one time our press would be like, okay, these picks have been fun. It's fun to read all the stuff. And I have 17 and control of 31. And I have all these swaps. It's like, now you just go ahead and do it. I don't even know if we would even get to that point. It's going to be a tough rumor season, though, for Bucks fans. Like if you're a parent of a Bucks fan, you're going to be updating them a lot and a lot of different stuff. I think Bucks fans are looking at it as just all the other teams trying to mess with their franchise. I don't think it's just that. I think it's just what this sport is, and always having to be kind of on edge, or at least just aware of what scenarios could play out if things are way below expectations.